The letter had been sitting on Wallace Quinn's kitchen table for 11 days, unopened, because he already knew what it said, and he did not know how to answer it. Outside the window of the Quinn ranch house, the Texas panhandle stretched away in every direction like a bolt of sun-bleached canvas that someone had forgotten to hem. It was the spring of 1882, and the land was just beginning to shake loose from winter's grip, the mesquite scrub budding pale green along the fence lines, the cattle growing fat and restless in the south pasture. Everything on the ranch was moving forward in the way that living things insist on moving forward, and Wallace Quinn alone seemed to be standing still. He was 34 years old, broad across the shoulders, with hands that were more scar than skin from years of rope work and branding irons. His hair was dark brown going to black, and his eyes were the particular shade of gray that the sky turns just before a serious storm. He was not an unhappy man by nature. He had been a happy man once, in fact, the kind of man who whistled while he rode fence line and told bad jokes at the dinner table and danced his wife around the kitchen on Saturday evenings when the week's work was done. That was before Sarah died. Sarah Quinn had been taken by a fever in the January of 1880, 2 years and some months past now, and she had left behind her a husband who no longer whistled and a 4-year-old son who, 6 months after her passing, had simply stopped talking. Not gradually, not with any obvious medical cause that the doctor in Amarillo could identify. Eli Quinn, who had been a chatterer, a question-asker, a boy who narrated his own adventures as he played them, had one morning in June of 1880 pressed his lips together and kept them that way. He was 6 now. He had not spoken a word in 2 years. The doctor said it was grief. He said it was shock. He said some children processed loss in ways that adults could not fully understand, and that patience and love were the only real medicines. Wallace had patience. He had love in quantities that sometimes felt like they might crack his chest open. But he did not have any idea how to reach the boy, how to pull him back across the silent distance that had opened between them, and that helplessness was the loneliest feeling he had ever carried. And then there was the letter. His neighbor, a rancher named Hector Beaumont who had known Wallace since boyhood, had placed an advertisement in a Kansas City newspaper on Wallace's behalf, without asking permission, because Hector Beaumont was exactly the kind of man who did things like that. The advertisement described a prosperous Texas cattle ranch, a widower of good character and sound temperament, a son who needed a mother's influence, and a willingness to provide a comfortable home for the right woman. It was, in Hector's estimation, a perfectly reasonable advertisement. Wallace had been furious when he found out. Then he had been embarrassed. Then the letter had arrived, and he had been something he could not quite name, something that sat in between terrified and curious and deeply, profoundly tired of being alone. The letter was written in a clear, unhurried hand on paper that smelled faintly of lavender, and the envelope was addressed with a precision that suggested the writer was someone who cared about getting details right. It had come from a town in Missouri called Carthage, and it was signed by a woman named Belle Carver, age 28, who described herself as a schoolteacher and the daughter of a farmer and his late wife. She wrote that she had no illusions about the difficulty of frontier life. She wrote that she had experience with children who were struggling, having spent 5 years in a classroom full of young people from all manner of hard circumstances. She wrote that she was not responding to his advertisement out of desperation or lack of options, but because something in the plain honesty of the wording had caught her attention and held it. She wrote one final sentence that Wallace had read so many times the paper was beginning to soften at the fold. "I am not asking you to love me, Mr. Quinn, only to give an honest acquaintance a fair chance, and I will ask the same of myself." That sentence was why he could not answer. It was too reasonable. It was too steady. It left him no comfortable place to hide behind a polite refusal. He was standing at the kitchen window with his coffee going cold in his hand, staring at the mesquite, when his son came in through the back door. Eli Quinn was a small boy, lean and quick, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's stubborn jaw. He moved with a careful deliberateness, as though the world were made of something more fragile than it appeared. He came to stand beside his father at the window and looked out at whatever his father was looking at, though he could not have known exactly what it was his father saw. Wallace looked down at him. The boy looked up. They communicated entirely in looks and gestures now, a private language that had grown rich and nuanced over 2 years of necessity. Wallace raised an eyebrow. Eli pointed at the coffee. Wallace handed it over and Eli took one experimental sip, made a face that was a very precise expression of his opinion of coffee, and handed it back. It was almost funny. It would have been funny if it had not broken Wallace's heart 3 times a week without fail. "I have to write back to that letter today," Wallace told him, not because he expected a response, but because he made a point of speaking to his son as though he were a full participant in the conversation. "The doctor had said that was important. I have been putting it off and it is not fair to the woman." Eli's eyes went to the letter on the table. He had seen it there for 11 days and had never touched it. Now he walked over to it, picked it up, and held it out to his father with an expression that was entirely unambiguous. It meant, "Then stop putting it off." "You're right," Wallace said. "You are absolutely right." He sat down at the table, pulled a sheet of paper toward him, and wrote Miss Belle Carver a letter that took him 3 drafts and most of the afternoon. He told her the truth about the ranch, about Eli, about the silence, about the fact that he was not sure he was doing any of it correctly, but that he was trying. He did not promise her anything he was not certain he could provide. He told her that if she was still inclined to come after reading the honest account of things, she would be welcomed with respect and genuine goodwill. He mailed it the following morning in the town of Ridgeway, which was 3 miles down a rutted road from the Quinn Ranch and consisted of a general store, a saloon, a feed and grain, a blacksmith, a small church with a crooked steeple, and a post office that shared its building with the barber shop. The reply came in 11 days. Belle Carver was coming in 3 weeks. She would be arriving on the afternoon stage from Amarillo. The 3 weeks that followed were the most productively anxious period of Wallace Quinn's adult life. He repaired the front porch steps that had been broken since October. He whitewashed the exterior of the house and painted the shutters the particular shade of green that Sarah had always wanted and he had never gotten around to. He had the spare bedroom thoroughly cleaned and the mattress replaced. He planted a small kitchen garden in the patch of ground beside the south wall of the house, because it seemed like the kind of thing a woman might appreciate, and also because it gave him something to do with his hands at 5 in the morning when he could not sleep. Eli watched all of this with quiet attention. The boy helped where he could, carrying the whitewash bucket, pulling weeds from the garden plot, holding the boards steady while Wallace nailed them. He was a good helper. He always had been. It was one of the things about him that made the silence so heavy, because you could see in every motion of his body that there was a great deal inside him, and none of it was coming out. On the morning of the day Belle Carver was due to arrive, Wallace dressed in his best shirt, which was a blue broadcloth that Sarah had ordered from a catalog in 1879, and which still fit him reasonably well. He told Eli to wash his face and hands, which Eli did without complaint. They drove the buckboard into Ridgeway at 2:30 in the afternoon and pulled up in front of the stage office, which shared a hitching post with the general store. The stage was late, as it almost always was. Wallace and Eli sat on the bench outside the stage office. A few townspeople moved past on the boardwalk, some of them glancing over with the particular quality of attention that small towns give to the business of their neighbors. Hector Beaumont's wife, a large, cheerful woman named Dottie, leaned out of the general store doorway and called across the street that she was praying for him, which Wallace found both touching and mortifying in equal measure. The stage arrived at 20 minutes past 4. It was dusty and loud and rocking on its springs when it came around the corner of Main Street. the driver calling to his horses with the practiced enthusiasm of a man who has done this particular job for too many years to find it romantic. It pulled up in front of the office, and the door swung open, and 3 passengers came out. The first was a cattle buyer Wallace recognized from a trade fair in Amarillo. The second was a young man in a checked coat who looked like he was new to Texas and had not yet fully come to terms with the heat. The third was Belle Carver. Wallace Quinn had formed no very specific picture of her in his mind. He had tried deliberately not to, because he thought that building an expectation and then finding it wrong would be a poor start. But if he had formed a picture, it would not have been this particular woman. She was of medium height, slender but not fragile-looking, with a quality of held-back energy that reminded him somehow of a well-bred horse that was being patient about it. Her hair was dark auburn, pinned up under a small traveling hat that had survived the journey with more dignity than the hat on the cattle buyer. Her eyes, when they found his across the dusty street, were brown with an amber undertone, the color of good whiskey held up to the light. She had a composed face that was not beautiful in the way of fashion plates, but was striking in the way of country things, like a clean-running creek or an honest piece of land, the kind of face you kept wanting to look at because it gave you something real to hold on to. She was carrying a carpet bag in one hand and a small leather satchel in the other, and she was looking around the street with a steady, assessing attention that suggested she was a person who oriented herself to new places by looking at them carefully rather than waiting to be told what to think. Her eyes found Wallace standing beside the buckboard, and she walked toward him without hesitation. "Mr. Quinn," she said. "Miss Carver," he said, "welcome to Ridgeway." They shook hands. Her grip was firm and unhesitating. Up close he could see that she had the fine lines around her eyes of someone who spent time outdoors and who laughed genuinely when she laughed. "This is Eli," Wallace said, and he looked down at his son, who had come to stand at his side. Eli looked up at Belle Carver with those dark, watchful eyes. He did not extend his hand because nobody had told him to, and he was a child who preferred not to do things if he was uncertain whether they were expected. He simply looked. Belle Carver crouched down, which immediately distinguished her from most adults Eli encountered, who tended to speak at him from their full height as though he were a post they were addressing. She crouched down and looked at him on level terms, and she said, "Hello, Eli. I have been looking forward to meeting you particularly." She did not wait for a response. She did not let the silence go awkward or fill it with anxious chatter. She simply made her statement and let it stand, and then she stood back up and turned to Wallace and said, "I hope the drive is not too far. I am thoroughly bounced." 3 miles, he said. "The road is better than the stage route." "That," she said, "is a very low bar to clear, but I will accept it." He helped her up to the buckboard seat. Eli climbed up on her other side without being asked and sat close to her, which was not something he had done with any adult other than his father in 2 years. Wallace noticed this and did not say anything about it. He climbed up, shook the reins, and turned the horses toward home. The drive was 3 miles on a road that ran between fence lines and open grassland, with the late afternoon sun throwing long shadows from the scrub mesquite, and the distant line of the Canadian River breaks showing on the western horizon in shades of purple and rust. Belle Carver watched all of it with that same careful attention she had given to the town, looking without comment for a while, and then saying, "It is much bigger than I expected. Texas. All of it, the sky especially." She looked up at it. "In Missouri, the sky is something you see above the trees. Here it is something that happens to you." Wallace looked out at the sky because her description made him see it fresh for a moment. "I have lived under it my whole life," he said. "I forget to look at it." "That seems like a shame." "It probably is." Eli was looking at Belle Carver sideways, with that particular quality of attention children give to things that interest them, and that they are not yet sure they have permission to be interested in. She did not return the looks directly, but Wallace could see from the slight shift in her posture that she was aware of them. They reached the ranch as the sun was touching the tops of the western breaks. The house looked better than it had in years, the fresh whitewash bright in the slanted light, the green shutters catching it. The kitchen garden was a neat rectangle of turned earth beside the south wall. The barn was solid and the fence line was straight, and the whole property had that quality of a hard-working place where the work was done with care. Belle Carver stepped down from the buckboard and stood looking at it for a moment. "It is a good house," she said, and there was nothing performative about it. She was making an assessment and she was sharing the result honestly. "Come inside," Wallace said. "I will put on coffee." The kitchen was the largest room and the warmest, and Wallace had cleaned it to within an inch of its life the day before. Belle set her carpetbag and satchel by the door and looked around at the room with the same methodical attention. She looked at the shelves of provisions, at the cast iron stove, at the good solid table, at the window over the sink that faced east and would catch the morning light. "Is that the letter?" she said, and Wallace turned to see her looking at the empty spot on the table where the letter had been for 11 days. "I moved it," he said, and felt foolish about both the moving and the fact that he had to explain it. She smiled at that. It was a real smile, the kind that starts in the eyes a half-second before it reaches the mouth. "I have been told I write a persuasive letter," she said. "You write an honest one," he said. "That is rarer." Over coffee, and over a supper that Wallace cooked with more care than usual and Belle offered to help with, and he let her, they talked. They talked carefully at first, with the measured exchange of two people who are taking each other's measure seriously, and then less carefully as the meal went on, following threads of conversation where they led. She told him about Carthage, about the one-room schoolhouse where she had taught, about the particular challenges of a classroom that had in the same morning session a 6-year-old who was just learning her letters and a 14-year-old who needed to understand long division before he could manage his father's accounts. She told it with a dry, warm humor that Wallace found unexpectedly comfortable, the kind of humor that came from genuine affection for difficult things rather than from distance from them. He told her about the ranch, about cattle prices, and the coming railroad spur they were hoping would reach Ridgeway before 1885, about the problem with the north fence that had been losing posts to the soil conditions for 3 years running. He talked about the land the way a person talks about something they love without necessarily examining the love directly. Eli sat at the table throughout supper and ate with his usual careful efficiency. He watched Belle Carver with uninterrupted attention. When she said something that was funny, he watched to see how funny it actually was, and when it was as funny as it appeared to be, he showed the faintest crease of a smile at the corner of his mouth, which was the most that could usually be hoped for. After supper, while Wallace was washing the dishes, Belle asked if she could look at the books on the small shelf in the sitting room. He said of course. He heard her settle into the chair by the window and the sound of pages turning. Eli drifted in from the kitchen and stood in the doorway of the sitting room, and Wallace, drying a plate, watched his son watch the woman who had come to their house, and felt something he could not precisely name shift inside his chest. She had been in the house for 4 hours and it already felt different. Not intrusively different, not like something had been rearranged. More like the way a room feels when someone opens the window on a good day, fuller of something that was supposed to be there. Belle Carver slept in the spare bedroom, which smelled of fresh paint and a small sachet of dried herbs that Dottie Beaumont had pressed into Wallace's hand with a knowing look, and the instruction to put it somewhere the room would smell pleasant. In the morning she was up before Wallace, and when he came downstairs, she was in the kitchen with the stove going and a pot of coffee already on. "I hope you do not mind," she said without turning around. "I could not sleep past 5. "I am up at 4:30 generally," he said. "You are ahead of me. I found the coffee and the grinder. Your beans are very good. There is a man in Amarillo who orders them from New Orleans." He sat down and she set a cup in front of him. It was a perfectly natural gesture, utterly without ceremony, and it landed on him with the weight of something he had not realized he had missed. "What are the mornings like here?" she asked, sitting down across from him with her own cup. "They are the best part," he said honestly. "The light comes up from behind the brakes and everything goes red and gold for about half an hour before it goes yellow. The cattle are moving. The birds are going. It is the best part of the day. Can I see it? Come outside." They stood on the front porch in the early dark and watched the sky do what the sky did in the Texas Panhandle in late April. And Belle Carver stood with her arms crossed against the morning chill and watched it without saying anything at all for a long time. And the silence between them was, for the first time since Sarah had died, a comfortable one. Not the silence of two people who had nothing to say, but the silence of two people who were both watching the same thing and finding it sufficient. "It does happen to you," she said quietly, when the red and gold tipped over into yellow. "It does," he agreed. Eli appeared at the door behind them, still in his nightshirt, his dark hair disordered from sleep. He looked between them once and then came to stand beside his father and looked at the sunrise too. Belle Carver did not make a fuss about the boy or say things like "look at you up so early" in the cooing tone that adults sometimes used, which Eli had a particular quiet hostility toward. She simply made room on the porch without comment, and the three of them watched the morning arrive together. Over the following days, Belle settled into the household, the way a sensible person moves into an unfamiliar space, with attention and without assumption. She did not attempt to reorganize things. She did not make suggestions about the way things were done unless she was asked. She asked to be shown where things were and how they worked, and she listened to the answers. She was up early every morning and she worked hard and without complaint, and the ranch, which had been running efficiently enough but with a kind of mechanical efficiency, a house kept orderly by determination rather than ease, began to breathe a little differently. She took her turns in the garden and proved to know more about growing things than Wallace had expected of a schoolteacher. She rode out with him one afternoon to look at the South pasture cattle, handling a horse with a competence that was not showy but was obvious, and she asked smart questions about the breeding program that showed she had been paying attention to what he said. She taught Eli to play checkers the third evening, sitting across from him at the kitchen table, and explaining the rules in a matter-of-fact way that treated him as fully capable of understanding them, which he was. They played 3 games. Eli won the second game and Belle accepted the defeat with a straight face and then said, without looking up from the board, "I want you to know that I let you win that one." The crease at the corner of Eli's mouth deepened into something that was very nearly a smile. Wallace watched from the doorway and thought that whatever he had been afraid of when he sat down to write that letter, it had not been anything like this. The difficulty, the thing that Wallace had not been fully prepared for, was what he felt when he watched her. He had told himself, in the weeks before her arrival and in his most honest letter, that what he was offering was respect and goodwill and a fair acquaintance. He had meant all of that. He had not accounted for the possibility that she would be exactly the kind of person that his best self found easiest to be around. He had not accounted for the way she laughed, which was generous and genuine, or the way she looked at the land as though it were worth looking at, or the way she spoke to Eli as though the boy were fully present even when he was silent, or the way she challenged Wallace on something in their second week, when he said something dismissive about the situation of the Comanche who had been removed from the Panhandle 8 years before. "They lived on this land for generations," she said, not with anger but with the steady firmness of someone stating a fact they consider non-negotiable. The removal was a brutal piece of business. Saying that it made room for settlement does not make it right. He had been raised to think of it differently and he knew it, and he said so. He said, "I was raised to see it one way and I have not thought carefully enough about another." "That is an honest thing to say," she said. "You are going to make me uncomfortable on a regular basis, aren't you?" he said, but without any real distress about it. "Only on the things that deserve discomfort," she said. He thought about that for a long time after. The question of what exactly she was doing at the ranch had a specific social status in Ridgeway, and its exact formulation depended on who you asked. The more charitable interpretation, held by people like Dottie Beaumont and the minister's wife, was that she was visiting as a potential match for Wallace Quinn, which was perfectly respectable and overdue, and everyone was glad something was being done about it. The less charitable version, held by one or two people who made a habit of less charitable interpretations, had something to say about the impropriety of a single woman staying in a single man's house. Wallace had anticipated this and had asked Belle, on the second day, whether she minded if they arranged for her to stay with the Beaumonts if she preferred it, for propriety's sake, and she had looked at him with a level expression, and said that she was 28 years old and capable of managing her own reputation, and if Ridgeway had concerns, it could address them to her directly. He had liked that more than he was prepared to say. 3 weeks into her stay, the question of what the arrangement actually was had not been formally addressed between them, and it sat between them like a word that both people in a conversation know needs to be said, and neither has quite found the right moment for. They were living, to all practical appearances, as a family. They ate together, worked the mornings in parallel, shared the evenings. Wallace found himself looking forward to the evenings in a way that was entirely new since Sarah's passing. Found himself thinking about things he saw during the day in terms of whether they were worth telling Belle about at dinner. The formal question came to a head on a Thursday morning when Hector Beaumont rode up to the fence line where Wallace was working and said, with the bluntness of old friendship, "What are your intentions toward that woman, Wallace, because she is too good a person to be left hanging on a hook?" "I am aware of that," Wallace said. "She will not wait forever." "She has given no indication of waiting at all," Wallace said. "She makes her own decisions and keeps her own counsel. I am the one who is slow." "Then be less slow," Hector said, and turned his horse around and rode back toward his own property. That evening after supper, after Eli had been put to bed with the half-hour of reading that Belle had instituted, which involved her sitting in the chair beside his bed and reading aloud from the book she had brought in her satchel, while the boy lay very still and listened with an attention that was palpable, Wallace and Belle sat on the front porch in the warm spring dark with their coffee, and Wallace said, "I think I owe you a clearer conversation than we have had." "I was wondering," she said mildly, "when we were going to have it." "I asked you here," he said, "because Hector put an advertisement in the paper that I was embarrassed about, and your letter was not what I expected, and I answered it because ignoring it seemed like the wrong thing to do to a person who had been honest with me. And now," he said, "you have been here 3 weeks, and I look forward to every day in a way I had forgotten was possible, and I am not sure whether to say that is something good or whether to be frightened by it." "It is something good," she said without hesitation. "Being frightened by something good is normal. It does not require you to run from it." "I am not running," he said. "I am sitting very still, which is different." "A little different," she agreed. He turned to look at her in the dim light from the kitchen window, and she was looking at him already, which was something he had noticed she did, looked at him directly when other people might look away, and it had the effect on him that direct things always had, which was to make the rest of the world go temporarily quiet. "I would like to ask if you would consider staying," he said. "Not as a visitor and not in the vague sense that we have been proceeding. I would like to ask you to marry me, if that is something you would consider." The porch was quiet for a moment. An owl called from somewhere in the dark mesquite, and the cattle moved in the south pasture with a distant sound like water. "Wallace," she said, "I came to Texas because your letter sounded like it was written by a man who was more interested in telling the truth than in making a good impression, and that is a rarer quality than you might suppose." She paused. "I would consider it seriously. I would need a little more time before I said yes, not because I have doubts about your character, but because I want to be certain of my own feelings and not simply certain that I am comfortable, because those are different things." "That is a fair distinction," he said. "Give me 2 weeks," she said. I can give you all the time you need. 2 weeks, she said firmly. I do not believe in unnecessary delay. The 2 weeks that followed had their own particular quality. Something between them had been spoken, and that made things clearer and somehow easier, as though naming the direction of travel made the road firmer underfoot. They talked more openly and argued more easily, because they no longer had to manage the formal carefulness of strangers. They argued one afternoon about the proper way to manage the feed situation for the winter cattle, Belle having a set of ideas from her father's farming operation that were not entirely applicable to a cattle ranch, but were not entirely irrelevant either, and the argument went on through supper and was still going during the washing up. And at some point, Wallace realized that he was enjoying the argument, that there was something about being disagreed with by someone who knew what they were talking about that was entirely pleasurable, and he said so, which made her laugh. My father always said that a person who never argues is either always right or always absent, she said. Which was he? He thought he was the first. He was usually the second. She told him about her father, who had died of a stroke when she was 23, leaving her the house and not much else, and how she had sold the house and used the money to finish her teaching qualification, and how she had taught for 5 years in Carthage with the knowledge that it was a good life but not quite the whole of the life she wanted. She was not sentimental about it. She had made her own way and she was satisfied with how she had managed it, but she was also honest about the fact that managing alone was different from choosing to be alone, and that the advertisement when she had seen it had seemed like a door that was worth trying. Did you answer others? Wallace asked. Other advertisements? 3, she said. I met 2 of them in person. They were both good men. They were just not the right fit. What made them the wrong fit? She thought about this for a moment. One of them needed a housekeeper more than he needed a wife, and he was not fully aware of the difference. The other one was kind and attentive, but he wanted someone to agree with him, and I cannot do that consistently. She paused. Your letter said you had no idea if you were doing things correctly, but that you were trying. That was the thing that made it different from the others. I was not trying to be appealing, he said. I was trying to be honest. I know, she said. That is exactly why it was appealing. On a Wednesday afternoon of the second week, something happened that moved everything forward faster than any conversation could have. Eli had gone out to the corral after the midday meal to watch the horses, which was his preferred afternoon occupation when the weather was good. Wallace was at the barn. Belle was in the kitchen garden. The sequence of events that followed was reported afterward by Wallace, who had seen most of it, and it went like this. A diamondback rattlesnake, which had been disturbed from its morning resting place under the water trough by the activity around the corral, had moved to the fence rail and positioned itself in the warm sun. Eli, who had been watching the horses with his full attention, stepped back from the fence and very nearly put his foot directly on the snake. The snake rattled. Eli froze. The snake was less than 2 feet away and coiled, and the sound of the rattle was the specific sound that every person raised on the Texas frontier understood immediately in their body, before they understood it in their mind. What happened next was that Belle Carver, who had heard the rattle from the kitchen garden, and had moved with a speed that surprised everyone including herself, came around the corner of the corral with a garden spade raised in both hands. The snake, at this sudden motion, turned its attention from Eli, and that was enough time for Belle to get between the boy and the snake and drive Eli back with one arm while she kept the spade ready with the other. She did not shout. She did not panic. She spoke to Eli in a low, steady voice that was somehow audible over his own hammering heartbeat and said, "Move straight backward. Slowly. I have it." The snake resolved its uncertainty in the direction of retreat, which snakes generally will if given the option and enough space, and unwound itself from its coil and moved toward the shadow under the water trough, and Belle stood with the spade up until it was gone. Then she turned around and looked at Eli, who was 3 steps back and very white and shaking. She knelt down in front of him. She took his face in both hands and looked at him directly and said, "You are all right." You were very still, and that was exactly the right thing. She kept her hands on his face and her eyes on his until the shaking slowed. "Breathe. You are all right," Eli breathed. And then, in a voice that came out rough and thin with 2 years of disuse, as though it had to find its way through all that silence like water finding its way through stone, Eli Quinn said, "I was scared." The two words stood up in the air between them like something that had been waiting its whole life to be said. Wallace, who had reached the corral fence by this time and heard his son's voice for the first time in 2 years, made a sound that was not a word at all, something that came from a place below language, and leaned on the fence rail because his legs were not entirely reliable. Belle did not move. She held Eli's face in her hands and looked at him steadily and said, "Being scared is the right response to a rattlesnake. It means your mind is working properly." She kept her voice level. She kept her eyes on him. "Do you know what that means, properly?" "It means right," Eli said. "That is exactly right," she said. She stayed in front of him until she was sure his color was back. Then she stood up and turned to find Wallace at the fence, and the look on his face was something she would remember for the rest of her life, a kind of raw, undone gratitude that made her throat tight. "He's all right," she said. "I know," Wallace said, but his voice was not entirely even. Eli walked to his father and Wallace crouched down and held him, and the boy let himself be held, and Belle Carver stood in the dusty corral with a garden spade in her hand and watched them and felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for a very long time. That evening, Eli talked through supper. Not much, not fluently, because 2 years of silence had left his speech a little effortful, a little careful, but he talked. He told his father that the horses had been running in circles that afternoon before the snake incident, which meant something, he thought. He asked Belle if the snake might come back. He asked if they could have pie. He talked in the halting way of someone learning a recovered language, and every sentence was received by his father with such visible, overwhelmed pleasure that it made the meal feel like a celebration. After Eli was in bed, Wallace came back downstairs and found Belle at the table with her hands around a cup of tea, and he stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her for a long moment before he said anything. "How did you know to do that?" he said. "After the snake, how did you know to stay so steady?" "I have had children in shock before," she said. "In the classroom. If you stay steady, they can find steady through you. It is the same as anything else. If one person holds still, the other one can use them to navigate." "He spoke," Wallace said. "He did. He has not spoken in 2 years." "I know." "Whatever it was," Wallace said, coming to sit at the table across from her, "whatever today did, I am more grateful than I can say." "Today frightened me," she said, and for the first time there was a crack in her steadiness, a slight tremor in the words. "When I heard that rattle, I did not think about being frightened, I only moved. But after, when I turned around and looked at him, I was frightened." "I know." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers where it lay around the teacup. It was a simple gesture. It was the first time they had touched in any way beyond the handshake on the first day, and they both felt the weight of that simplicity. "I want to say yes," she said quietly. "I want to say yes now, if that is all right. I do not need the 2 weeks to be done." "It is more than all right," he said. They sat for a moment with his hand over hers in the warm kitchen, and the night outside was enormous, and the stars were the sharp, close stars of the panhandle that looked like someone set fire to the whole sky. "Then yes," she said. "Yes," he said. The wedding was arranged for the 3rd Saturday of May, which gave them just over 2 weeks, and Ridgway had opinions about this timeline that ranged from delighted to scandalously rushed. But since both Wallace and Belle had the specific immunity to other people's opinions that comes from having managed their own affairs through some difficulty, the opinions of Ridgway did not materially affect the planning. Dottie Beaumont made herself indispensable and magnificent, and organized the women of the church into a catering operation that would have provisioned a small regiment. The minister, a thin, patient man named Reverend Cal, met with Wallace and Belle together and separately and pronounced himself, satisfied that they were entering into the arrangement with full understanding and serious intent. Hector Beaumont, upon hearing the news, rode to the Quinn ranch, dismounted, walked up to Wallace and shook his hand for a very long time and then walked back to his horse without a word, which was how Hector expressed deep satisfaction. Eli was told by his father, carefully and with full attention to the boy's response. Wallace sat with him on the porch steps on a quiet morning and said that Miss Carver had agreed to stay, to be part of their family, to be his father's wife, and he wanted to know how Eli felt about that. Eli considered for a while in the way that he did, seriously and with his full concentration. Then he said, "She stays after she is my mother. She is here for good," Wallace confirmed. Eli nodded once with the definitive quality of someone approving a sound decision. "Good," he said. The word came out clear and firm, and Wallace put his arm around the boy's shoulders and squeezed once, and they looked out at the mesquite and the morning sky together. In the days before the wedding, Wallace and Belle had their evenings and the question of everything behind them, all the life they had lived separately that now had to be laid alongside each other, had a strange intimacy about it. She told him about the years in Carthage in more detail, about the students she had taught and the ones she still thought about, the children who had come to school hungry and the children who came already knowing they were not expected to learn, and how she had tried to dismantle that expectation one morning at a time. She told it with a passion that was not performative, the kind of passion that comes from caring about something in the bones. He told her about Sarah, which he had not yet done and which felt important to do honestly. He told her that Sarah had been his childhood friend before she was anything else, that they had known each other since they were 10 years old, that losing her had felt like losing a piece of himself that could not be replaced. He told her that he was not trying to replace Sarah, and that he did not expect Belle to be Sarah's replacement, and he asked her if that was something she understood. "I would not want to replace her," Belle said. "She gave Eli life and she loved him and she loved you, and she is part of why you both are who you are. I would not want to erase that even if it were possible." She paused. "I want to add to it, that is all." "That is the right thing to say," he said. "It is the true thing," she said. "I find that the two are usually the same, which is convenient." The morning of the wedding was brilliant and clear, the kind of spring morning the panhandle sometimes produces when it is feeling generous, where the air has a dry sweetness to it and the light is so clean and flat that everything stands out as though cut from paper. The church filled up with what appeared to be most of Ridgeway and a considerable portion of the surrounding ranch country, which spoke to the general goodwill toward Wallace Quinn and the considerable curiosity about the woman he was marrying. Belle Carver wore a dress that was not a wedding dress exactly, because she had not brought a wedding dress to Texas on the assumption that she might need one. It was the best dress she had, a deep blue-green wool chally with a small lace collar, and she wore her hair down for the first time since she had arrived, which had the effect of making her look like an entirely different version of herself. Not softer exactly, but less managed, more herself. Wallace, when he saw her come through the church doors with Dottie Beaumont's arm through hers, thought that he had not yet fully appreciated how beautiful she was, and the thought arrived with a slightly stunned quality, as though he had turned a corner and found a landscape he was not prepared for. Eli stood beside his father at the front of the church, very clean and wearing a shirt collar that he found oppressive but was tolerating with stoicism. When Belle reached the altar and looked down at him, he gave her the particular nod that was his highest form of approval, and she gave him a small private smile that was just between the two of them. The ceremony was brief and honest, because both of them had asked Reverend Cal for exactly that. When Wallace put the ring on her hand, which had been his mother's ring and which fit Belle almost exactly, she looked at it for a moment, and then looked at him with an expression that was unguarded and warm and real. And he held her gaze and thought that he would remember this moment for the rest of his life, not because it was the most dramatic thing that had ever happened to him, but because it was the truest. The celebration at the church hall afterward was large and loud, and involved a fiddle player from 3 ranches over, and a spread of food that justified every opinion Dottie Beaumont had ever held of her own organizational abilities. Wallace danced with his wife, which was a sentence he had not been able to say in 2 years and which felt extraordinary. She danced well, with the same self-contained confidence she brought to everything else, and he was not a bad dancer himself, and the combination of these 2 facts meant that they looked as though they had been doing this for years. Eli was persuaded to dance once by Dottie's youngest granddaughter, a relentless 7-year-old named Clara who took him by both hands and would not accept refusal. He bore this with visible suffering, and then appeared to decide that it was not entirely terrible, and danced with a seriousness of purpose that made the watching adults press their lips together to keep from laughing. At the end of the evening, driving home in the dark with the stars overhead and Eli asleep between them on the buckboard seat, his head tipped against Belle's arm, Wallace felt a sensation that it took him several miles to identify. It was the specific sensation of a weight he had been carrying so long that he had stopped noticing it, having been lifted. It was not that the grief was gone, or that the difficulty was over, or that the silence of the past 2 years had been unmade. It was something simpler and more complete than that. It was the sensation of being where he was supposed to be, with the people he was supposed to be with, going home. The summer that followed the wedding was the first summer in several years that the Quinn ranch felt inhabited in the full sense of the word. Belle took over the accounts and found 2 billing errors in the arrangements with the cattle buyer that had been costing Wallace money for the better part of 18 months. She wrote the corrections in letters so crisp and precise that the cattle buyer, a man not accustomed to being corrected, paid the balance without argument. Wallace told her she was terrifying. She said she preferred to think of it as thorough. She began to teach Eli in earnest, because there was no school in Ridgeway that was close enough to the ranch for a child of 6 to attend without a daily escort, and the plan was to send him to school in the fall when a new schoolhouse was due to open nearer to town. In the meantime, Belle set up a corner of the sitting room as a classroom, with a small chalkboard she ordered from Amarillo, and a set of reading primers and arithmetic texts from her own collection. Eli's voice came back with the same gradual determination with which spring comes to difficult country, inch by inch, and not always in a straight line. There were still mornings when he was quiet in a way that felt different from regular morning quiet, when he sat at the breakfast table and looked at something in the middle distance and did not speak. On those mornings, Belle did not push. She made breakfast and said the ordinary things and let the morning proceed at its own pace, and usually by mid-morning Eli would surface from wherever he had been and say something about the horses or ask a question about whatever they had been reading the day before. Wallace asked her once how she knew when to push and when to wait, and she said, "Eli tells me if you pay attention, not in words, but in where he puts his eyes and how he holds his body. He is very clear if you know how to read him." "I have been learning to read him for 6 years, Wallace said. "You are very good at it," she said. "Better than you know. You kept him talking to you in every way you knew how all through those 2 years, even when he could not answer. That is not nothing. That is most of what kept him anchored." He did not respond to this, but he held it carefully. They had their first real argument of the marriage in July, over a decision Wallace made about the north pasture fence without consulting her. He had decided to move the fence line to incorporate a section of grazing land that bordered the public range, which was a common enough practice, but which had some legal ambiguity attached to it in the current political climate of land claims and boundary disputes that were becoming more heated as the panhandle settled up. Belle pointed this out in some detail, and Wallace said he had managed the ranch for 10 years without legal difficulties, and he knew the land custom. Belle said that land custom and land law were moving apart very rapidly in 1882, and that a man with a child and a wife, and a 15-year mortgage on good cattle land should be more careful about legal ambiguity than a single man with no dependents needed to be. The phrase "a child and a wife" stopped him cold, not because it was wrong but because it was exactly right, and it reminded him, in the sharpest possible way, that the decisions he made were not only his to make anymore. He moved the fence line back to its original position and told her she was right without making a production of it, because he thought that making a production of conceding a valid point was more about ego than about truth, and she nodded once and said thank you for hearing it, and they went to supper. "You do not enjoy being told you are right," he said at the table. "I do not enjoy arguments," she said. "I enjoy the resolution. You seem very comfortable in the argument itself." "I am comfortable in the argument," she said with a slight smile. "I simply do not enjoy it." He thought about that distinction for several days. In August, Belle discovered she was pregnant. She told Wallace on a Tuesday morning before breakfast, standing in the kitchen in the early light with her arms crossed and an expression that was trying to be composed and was not entirely succeeding. He sat very still for a moment, and then stood up from the table and crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her, and she let herself be held in a way that she usually did not, with her forehead against his shoulder and her hands at his back, and neither of them said anything for a long time. "I know it is fast," she said finally against his shoulder. "It is not too fast," he said. "Nothing about this has gone faster than it should." She pulled back and looked at him. Her eyes were bright. "I am glad," she said, and it was a simple statement and entirely whole. "So am I," he said, "more than I know how to say." Eli was told at supper that evening, with the same honesty and directness that had been applied to all difficult news in the Quinn household. Wallace told him that he was going to have a brother or a sister in the spring, that Miss Belle, his mother, which was how Eli had begun to refer to her, and which had arrived naturally and without ceremony, was expecting a baby. Eli considered this information for a very long time. He took 3 slow bites of his supper. He appeared to conduct an internal review of the implications. Then he said, "Which one?" "Which one what?" Wallace said. "Brother or sister," Eli said with some impatience, which was a tone he had recently begun deploying and which his father found both maddening and quietly delightful. "We do not know yet," Belle said. "How do you find out?" "When the baby is born," she said. Eli considered this further. "It should be a brother," he said with finality. "I will pass the preference along," Belle said gravely. Wallace caught her eye across the table, and a look passed between them that was quick and private and warm. The kind of look that belongs only to 2 people who have built something together and can see it. September brought the fall cattle drive, which was the largest single event of the Quinn Ranch's yearly calendar, and which required Wallace to be away from the ranch for 10 days driving the herd to the railhead at Canadian, 40 miles north. He had done it alone before, or rather with the help of his ranch hand, a taciturn Tejano named Ignacio Flores, who had worked the Quinn Ranch for 7 years and was worth 3 ordinary hands by Wallace's private accounting. The question of whether Belle and Eli would come or stay was one that they discussed with some care. Belle thought they should stay, on the practical grounds that she was beginning to show, and a cattle drive was not the most comfortable experience for a pregnant woman, and Eli was young enough that the drive would be more danger than adventure. She said this plainly, and Wallace agreed, and they arranged for Dottie Beaumont to be available in case of need, and for old Jim Harker, who had the small homestead a mile east, to check in daily. Saying goodbye for 10 days was harder than Wallace had expected it to be, given that he had managed 10 years of being alone, and these were only 10 days. Belle seemed to find this slightly amusing, in the fond rather than mocking way that she had. She stood at the porch rail in the early morning as he loaded the drive supplies, and she said, with a perfect deadpan, "You are going to miss the coffee." "I am going to miss everything," he said, more honestly than he had intended. She came down off the porch and stood in front of him and straightened his collar in a gesture that was matter-of-fact and tender in equal parts. "10 days," she said. "Come back careful." "I always come back," he said. "I know," she said. "I am asking you to also come back in good condition." He kissed her then, which was a thing that still had a slight newness to it, not awkward but not yet habitual, and she put her hand against his jaw for a moment with a warmth that he carried all the way to Canadian and back. Eli ran to the fence when Wallace mounted and called out, "Bring something back," which was a complete sentence and a demand and the most normal 6-year-old thing he had said since he was 4, and Wallace laughed riding out of the yard at the sheer, ordinary, beautiful fact of it. The drive went well. The herd was healthy, the price at the railhead was good, and Ignacio was as steady and skilled as he had always been. They had one night of weather that required 3 hours in the saddle keeping the herd calm, and Wallace had a short conversation with a fellow rancher at the railhead about the railroad spur to Ridgeway, which was now being described as a near certainty for 1884, which was excellent news. He was back on the Quinn Ranch property by the afternoon of the 9th day, coming in under the early sunset, and the house had lamplight in the windows and smoke from the kitchen chimney, and the smell of supper carrying on the evening air. Belle came to the door when she heard the horse in the yard, and for a moment she was just a shape in the doorway against the warm light of the kitchen, and then she stepped out and he saw her face and thought again, with the same slightly stunned quality he had felt at the church, that he had not yet fully accounted for how glad he was that she existed. 9 days, she said from the porch steps. The weather cooperated, he said, dismounting, or we'd have been 11. The herd, full price, good year. She came down the steps and stood in front of him in the cooling evening air and looked at him for a moment with that direct, assessing look. "You are tired," she said. "Presently," he said. She smiled at that. "Eli has been telling me everything there is to know about the habits of horses," she said. "I know more about horses than I ever expected to know. That will serve you well in this part of the world. He is also reading," she said, and the quiet pride in her voice was something he recognized as belonging to a teacher more than a mother, the specific pleasure of watching a mind take hold of something. "He read 3 pages to me last night, slowly but correctly." "You are extraordinary," Wallace said. She looked slightly startled, in the way she did when he said something directly affectionate, as though she was still adjusting to the fact that it was directed at her. "I am a schoolteacher," she said. "Teaching is what I know." "I am not talking about the teaching," he said. They looked at each other in the September evening, and the sky behind the breaks was the color of embers, and the horses stood quiet in the yard, and the whole world was exactly the right size. Eli appeared at the door behind his stepmother, saw his father, and came down the steps at a speed that suggested all dignity had been temporarily suspended, and Wallace caught him and lifted him, and the boy put both arms around his father's neck and held on with a completeness that was almost painfully dear. "Did you bring something?" Eli asked into his shoulder. "A piece of candy from a store in Canadian." "What kind?" "Peppermint." Eli leaned back and considered this with the air of someone evaluating an investment. "Good," he said. The winter was a good one by panhandle standards, which meant it was hard but not brutal, the cold coming in steady and dry rather than in the howling ice storms that could bury the panhandle for weeks at a time. The ranch settled into its cold weather rhythms, and the house was warm and full in a way that was entirely new. Belle grew large and then very large and managed this with the same practical steadiness she brought to everything else, complaining once about the difficulty of bending down to reach the lower kitchen shelves, and then solving the problem by rearranging the lower shelves so that the things she needed most were not on the bottom. She continued teaching Eli through the winter, and by November he was reading well enough that she gave him a proper reader to take through at his own pace, which he did in 3 weeks. She also found time in the evenings to begin a letter correspondence with a teacher in Amarillo who was working to establish better schools in the Panhandle region, an effort that was underfunded and politically complicated by the various interests competing for what little territorial budget existed. She wrote letters about curriculum and about the needs of ranch children who might be miles from the nearest school and about the importance of libraries, And she talked about all of this at the supper table, and Wallace listened and thought about his wife who had arrived with a carpetbag and had within a year become something essential to the shape of everything around her. "Do you miss teaching?" he asked her one evening. "Every day," she said, without hesitation. "But this is different from missing something because it is gone. I miss it the way you miss a river when you are not near it. The river is still there. I will be back to it when we have Ridgeway School properly organized." "You intend to teach at the Ridgeway School?" "I intend to organize the Ridgeway School and then teach at it, yes," she said, as though this were a fully formed plan that he must have known about, which he had not, but which seemed entirely consistent with everything he knew of her. "We would need to work out the arrangement," he said. "We have a 7-year-old who can help with lighter chores and a reliable ranch hand and a husband who manages very well," she said. "I think the arrangement will work itself out." He agreed to this without further argument, because she was right and also because arguing with Belle Carver Quinn on a matter she had already decided required a quality of perseverance that he saved for important occasions. The baby came in the early days of March 1883, in the manner of most frontier births, which was to say with the assistance of a capable midwife from Ridgeway named Mrs. Donahue, and a great deal of determined effort from Belle, and a significant quantity of pacing from Wallace in the kitchen, where Eli sat at the table and watched his father walk back and forth with the focused attention of someone watching a scientific demonstration. "Does it always take this long?" Eli asked, somewhere around the 3rd hour. "First babies sometimes do," Wallace said, though his knowledge of this was entirely second-hand. "Is she all right?" "Mrs. Donahue is very experienced," Wallace said, which did not quite answer the question but was the most he could honestly offer. Eli thought about this. "She will be fine," he said, with the absolute conviction of someone who has decided that a particular outcome is the only acceptable one and is simply stating it as fact. "Yes," Wallace said, "she will. She was fine." The baby arrived in the late evening as a red-faced, outraged, and apparently extremely opinionated boy whom they named Henry after Wallace's father, and who had, from the first moment of his life, the quality of a person who intended to make himself felt. Belle held him and looked at him with an expression of exhausted wonder, and when Wallace sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the two of them together, he felt the expansion of something in his chest that he had no name for, only the understanding that his capacity for feeling had just grown to include something new. Eli was brought in to see his brother, which he did with the grave solemnity of a senior official inspecting a new appointment. He stood beside the bed and looked at Henry for a long time and then said, "He is very small," which was accurate, and then, "He is loud," which was also accurate, and then, without further comment, sat down in the chair beside the bed and kept vigil in his characteristic quiet way for the next 2 hours. Henry Quinn grew the way babies grow on ranches, which is quickly and in all directions, nourished by good air and early mornings, and the constant ambient noise of a working household. He was walking by fall and talking, with remarkable fluency, by the following spring, which led Eli, now 8, to observe to his father that his brother talked more than any reasonable person needed to, a statement that Belle received with a private expression that she shared with Wallace only after Eli had left the room. The spring of 1884 brought two things that changed the rhythm of the Quinn Ranch and the town of Ridgeway simultaneously. The first was the railroad spur, which arrived in April exactly as promised and transformed the cattle shipping business in the region in ways that were immediately and practically significant. The second was the opening of the Ridgeway Schoolhouse. Belle had been working toward the school's opening for over a year, in correspondence with the county board and with private donors, and with the Territorial Education Office, and with every teacher and interested party she could recruit to the cause. She had designed the curriculum, she had arranged the textbooks, and she had, with the full support of Wallace and the logistical assistance of Hector Beaumont and a small committee of interested townspeople, made herself the obvious candidate for the teaching position. There was one member of the county board who expressed the opinion that a married woman with children of her own had no business taking a teaching position that might be needed by a single woman who had no other prospects. And Belle addressed this opinion in a letter of such surgical precision and polite devastation that the board member in question forwarded the letter to 3 colleagues, with the note that the Quinn woman was either the most capable or the most formidable person he had encountered in his 20 years of public service, and he could not decide which. She began teaching at the Ridgeway School in September of 1884, 3 days a week, with Eli as one of her pupils, which was an arrangement he found both mortifying and secretly fine. She taught 15 children ranging in age from 6 to 12 in the single room, and she did it with the same clear-eyed, patient rigor she had brought to the Carthage school, and within a month parents were coming from 6 miles out to bring their children to her classroom. Wallace rode her to school and back on the teaching days, which was partly practical and partly a preference he did not fully examine. The rides were 30 minutes in each direction, and they used them well, talking through the events of the day past and the plans for the day ahead in the way of 2 people who have built a life together and continue to build it at every available opportunity. Eli gave the correct answer to a long division problem today before I had finished writing it on the board, she told him on a Tuesday in October. Was that a problem? For the 2 children who had already given incorrect answers? Somewhat. But I managed it. How? I told Eli that knowing the answer and knowing when to share the answer are 2 different skills, and that the second is equally important to the first. He considered this for approximately 90 seconds and then nodded as though I had said something inarguable. That is because you had said something inarguable, Wallace said. He is very much like you in that quality, she said. When he decides something is correct, he does not require further convincing. He simply proceeds. Is that a compliment? She smiled at the road ahead. It is an observation, she said. Make of it what you will. He made of it what he would, which was to reach over from his horse to hers and briefly take her hand, which she allowed, and they rode the rest of the way home in the comfortable silence that was one of the best things they had, the silence of 2 people who have no need to fill the space between them, because the space between them is already full. Henry, by this time, was a robust and cheerful 1-year-old who had very strong opinions about everything in his immediate environment, and communicated these opinions through a combination of determined mobility and an extensive vocabulary that he had apparently been assembling in private for months before deploying it all at once. He had his mother's coloring, the auburn hair and the amber-brown eyes, and he had his father's jaw and his father's habit of looking directly at things and deciding about them quickly. He was also completely devoted to his older brother, following Eli around the ranch with the uncritical adoration of the very young for the slightly less young, and Eli bore this with more patience than anyone had expected of him, and occasional bursts of genuine affection that he would have denied if pressed. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was the hardest winter the Quinn ranch faced in that period. A series of blizzards came through the panhandle in January that were severe enough to cause stock losses across the region, and the Quinn ranch was not exempt. They lost 11 cattle to the cold in a single week in late January, and the fence line on the north pasture came down under the weight of ice, and there were 4 days during the worst of it when the family was essentially housebound. The cold outside, the kind of cold that moved through wool coats as though they were paper. Those 4 days were long and sometimes claustrophobic, and tested every member of the household in different ways. Henry, who was not yet 2 and did not understand the concept of being housebound, required constant supervision and entertainment, and was a remarkably effective agent of chaos for someone his size. Eli, who was 8 and accustomed to having outdoor space to himself for portions of the day, went through a period of restless silence that his parents recognized and managed carefully. Wallace, who had 11 cattle dead in the north pasture that he could not recover until the weather broke and who had a fence down that he could not repair, spent 2 of the 4 days in a tight, contained tension that Belle addressed by sitting down across from him at the kitchen table on the second evening and saying, "Tell me how bad it is in terms of what it changes." "It changes the spring buying plan," he said. "It does not change the survival of the ranch." "Then it is manageable." "It is manageable," he said, and the saying of it helped, which was something he had learned about her, that she had a way of making things real in words that made them smaller than the formless fear of them. "Good," she said. "Then I am going to make bread because we have 2 housebound children and a housebound husband, and bread making requires a great deal of flour mess that Henry finds entertaining." She made bread. Henry sat in the flour and was entranced. Eli came in from the sitting room where he had been staring at the wall and stood at the kitchen table, and eventually, at his stepmother's invitation, began kneading his own small portion of dough. By evening the kitchen smelled of warmth and yeast, and the blizzard outside was the same blizzard, but it was outside, and they were inside, and the 4 of them ate bread fresh from the oven at the table, and the evening was good. Spring came to the panhandle in the slow, argumentative way it had, and the losses were tallied and addressed, and the fence was repaired, and the spring buying plan was adjusted. The cattle market in 1885 was strong enough to make up much of what the winter had cost them, and by June, the Quinn ranch was moving forward again with the reliable momentum that Wallace had spent a decade building into it. Belle was expecting again, which she told Wallace in May with the same slightly unguarded expression she had worn when she told him about Henry, as though the fact of it still surprised her each time, the specific miracle of it. He received it with the same warm certainty, the knowledge that good things kept being added to good things in a way that felt like more than luck. "Eli thinks it should be a girl this time," she said. "Has Eli expressed an opinion?" "Eli has expressed a very precise opinion, which was that Henry is enough of a brother, and a sister would be different, and different was currently preferable." Wallace laughed at that, a full, genuine laugh that Eli would have found gratifying. "What do you think?" "I think I am 8 months away from knowing, and I am not going to spend 8 months speculating," she said. "I have a school to run and a ranch to help manage and a 7 and almost 2-year-old to manage, and whatever the baby is, the baby will fit into the life we have and we will adjust." "You are remarkably practical about everything," he said. "I come from practical people," she said. "And I married a practical man, which helps." He came around the table and put his arms around her from behind, his hands flat on her waist, and she leaned back against him for a moment with a sigh that was entirely contented. And the kitchen was full of the afternoon light from the east window and the sound of Henry in the sitting room explaining something important to a wooden horse. And outside the yard was green, and the cattle were fat in the south pasture, and the fence line was straight, and the garden was already showing green tips in the turned earth. The daughter arrived in November of 1885. She was named Clara, which was also the name of Dottie Beaumont's persistent granddaughter who had danced with Eli at the wedding, and she arrived in the world with a composure that was so clearly her mother's that the midwife commented on it. She was a dark-haired, serious-faced infant who looked at the world around her from the first with an expression of thoughtful assessment, as though she were taking stock of the available information before committing to a response. Eli, who was now 9 and had spent months refining his opinion about the desirability of a sister, looked at her for a long time in the manner of his most considered judgments and then said, "She looks like she knows something," which was, by universal agreement, exactly right. Henry, who was 2.5 and had very recently accepted that there was a third person coming to live in the house, regarded his sister with the mixed feelings of a person whose territory has just been reduced and who suspects, correctly, that the reduction is permanent but who is already beginning to see potential applications. He gave her a wooden block, which was his most significant portable possession, as a welcome gift, and accepted her status as a member of the household with a practical graciousness that Belle found touching and entirely characteristic. The years that followed built themselves in the way that good years build, not dramatically but with a deep accretion of ordinary things that add up to something solid and warm and real. The ranch prospered. The railroad spur changed the economics of the cattle operation in ways that allowed Wallace to expand the breeding program and reduce the distance and cost of the drives. Ignacio Flores, the ranch hand, eventually brought his wife and 2 children to live in a small house that Wallace helped him build on the eastern edge of the Quinn property. And the 2 families shared work and sometimes meals, and the particular friendship of people who have worked hard side by side through difficult things. Belle continued to teach at the Ridgeway School, which grew under her management from 1 room to 2, and eventually to a 3-room building with a small library that she had organized from donated books, and from a campaign she ran through correspondence with 2 publishing houses in St. Louis who were, by her assessment, not being asked often enough to support frontier education. One of the publishers sent a crate of readers and arithmetic texts that arrived in Ridgeway to considerable excitement, and which Belle distributed with the careful equity of someone who has thought very hard about fairness. Eli, who had not spoken for 2 years, and who had come back to language one frightened afternoon in a corral with a rattlesnake and a woman who held her ground, became a student of thoroughgoing capability, and then a young man of quiet intelligence and direct expression. He had his father's steady quality and his stepmother's habit of looking at things until he understood them, and he had a gift for mathematics that Belle recognized early and fed carefully, ordering advanced texts from Amarillo and sitting with him in the evenings to work through problems that were beyond what the Ridgeway School could provide. Henry was everything his initial impressions suggested he would be, which was loud and bold and boundlessly curious and occasionally exhausting, and deeply affectionate in the offhand way of children who are secure enough in their loves that they do not feel the need to perform them. He had strong opinions about everything and the energy to defend them, and he was, by unanimous agreement of everyone who knew him, very much his own person. Clara grew into exactly the child her expression at birth had promised, a thoughtful, careful girl who noticed everything and said what she thought, and had a particular gift for drawing that nobody in the family could fully account for, though Belle mentioned once that her own mother had painted watercolors, which led Wallace to feel an odd gratitude toward a woman he had never met. There was a morning in the spring of 1889, when Eli was 13 and Henry was 6 and Clara was 3, when Wallace came downstairs to find Belle already at the kitchen table with her coffee, looking at the east window where the light was just beginning to come through. She did not hear him on the stairs, and he paused in the doorway for a moment and looked at her in the early morning, this woman who had arrived on the afternoon stage 7 years ago with a carpetbag and an honest letter, and a quality of steadiness that he had needed more than he had known. She was 35 now, with a few more lines around her eyes from the sun and the laughter and the years, and she was still the most real-looking person he had ever seen, the kind of face and presence that you could not look away from because it gave you something true. He came into the kitchen and sat down across from her. "You are watching me," she said, without looking away from the window. "I am," he said. "Is there a reason?" "I was thinking," he said, "about the letter." She turned to look at him. "Which letter?" "Your first letter, the one that sat on the table for 11 days. You told me it was 9 days. "It was 11, he said. I was embarrassed to say 11. I was not ready to say how long I had been standing still. She smiled at him across the table. "And what were you thinking about it?" "I was thinking about what you wrote at the end," he said. "The sentence about not asking me to love you, only asking for a fair chance. I remember writing it. I could not answer it," he said, "because it was too honest and it left me nowhere to hide, and I have thought about that sentence more times than I can count over the past 7 years. "What do you think about it now?" she said. He looked at her across the kitchen table in the early morning light. "I think you were wrong about the love part," he said. "You were wrong to say you were not asking me to love you. You should have asked. It was well worth asking for." She looked at him for a long moment, and her expression did the thing it sometimes did, the thing he had been watching it do for 7 years, where the composure came off like a coat in warm weather and underneath was something open and unguarded and purely itself. "Wallace," she said. "I love you," he said. "I know I do not always say it with the frequency it deserves. I am saying it now." "I love you," she said, and it was simple and whole, and it sat between them as naturally as the coffee cups and the morning light. "I loved you before I knew what to call it. I think I loved the honesty in your letter before I had any idea what you looked like." Outside the window, the Texas panhandle was waking up in the April light, the mesquite putting out its pale green buds, the cattle moving in the south pasture, the horses in the corral standing in the early warmth. The ranch was good and solid and real, built by a decade of his own work, and then built again, differently, by the addition of her. Henry's voice appeared at the top of the stairs, calling down with the cheerful authority of a 6-year-old who saw no reason why everyone else should have the morning to themselves. And Clara's smaller voice followed it with a question about something that was evidently very urgent. And upstairs the day was beginning in the way it always began, loud and immediate and full. Belle stood up from the table and refilled both their coffee cups and looked at him with that direct, warm, completely honest look that had been the thing about her from the very beginning, the thing he had fallen toward without entirely knowing it, the thing that had answered the question of the letter before he had found the words to answer it himself. "Come on, then," she said. "They are awake." "They are always awake," he said, but he was smiling and she was smiling, and the morning was coming through the window in the clean flat light of the Texas spring, and the house was full of children and coffee, and the sounds of a working day beginning, and the letter on the table had long since been answered, and everything that had been silent had found its voice, and everything that had been alone had found its other half, and the land stretched out in every direction as far as you could see. Honest and enormous and wholly good, they went upstairs together to meet the morning. The years came in after that with the reliable grace of a country that has learned how to keep faith with the people who love it, slow in the big things and quick in the small ones, full of the ordinary extraordinary of a life built right. The Quinn Ranch added a second barn in the fall of that same year, and the following spring Eli began talking seriously about the university in Austin that accepted applications from young men of demonstrated academic ability, a possibility that Wallace and Belle had been quietly nurturing in his direction for 2 years, and that arrived, when Eli raised it himself at the supper table, as one of those moments where all the invisible work of good parenting becomes suddenly visible. "You want to go to Austin," Wallace said. "I want to study engineering," Eli said. "The railroad is changing everything, and I want to understand how it works and how to make it work better." "That is a good reason," Belle said, and she said it with the particular quality she had when she was most proud of something, the quality of controlled warmth, like a fire that is very large and being kept in a hearth that is exactly the right size. "You could come back," Wallace said. "After." "I expect I will come back," Eli said. "But I want to know more than what this piece of ground can teach me before I decide what to do with knowing it." "That is the right way to think about it," Belle said. Wallace looked at his son across the table, this boy who had gone silent for 2 years and come back and grown into a young man of 13 who talked about his future in complete sentences with his head up and his eyes clear, and felt the particular gratitude of a parent who knows that the good outcome was not guaranteed and appreciates it the more for that. "We will arrange it," Wallace said, "when you are ready." And they would, and they did. And the ranch kept running, and the school kept teaching, and Henry grew into himself with tremendous energy, and Clara drew pictures of horses and flowers and faces with the careful precision of someone who sees the world very accurately. And Belle Carver Quinn taught every child in the Ridgeway region who wanted to be taught, and some who did not know they wanted it yet. And Wallace Quinn looked at his land and his family, and the life that had grown from an answered letter and thought, on a regular basis, in the quiet moments of early mornings and good evenings, that the best thing he had ever done was sit down at that kitchen table and write back. The letter that had sat for 11 days had opened a door, and on the other side of the door was everything. And the last thing Wallace Quinn thought, on a warm evening in May of that excellent year, sitting on the front porch he had repaired before her arrival with his wife beside him and the sound of his children inside the house, was that there was nothing still. Everything was moving, everything was growing, everything was building on itself in the way that living things insist on doing, and he was not standing still anymore. He had not been standing still for a long time. The sky was doing what the sky does in the Texas panhandle, which is to say that it was enormous and full of color and entirely indifferent to whether you were watching, and they were both watching, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in every sense of the word, everything.